Mark Rutte is the Secretary General of NATO, and amid some of the ruminations from President Trump this week, expressing his displeasure with NATO countries who are resistant to join America in the effort to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and get maritime traffic flowing again. Mark Rutte had this to say about his consultations with said Western European leaders who his characterization of it is a lot more constructive than some of what we've heard from, say, Keir Starmer and Macron to date.
Of the ballistic missiles, of the nuclear capability is severely degraded. When it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, I've been in contact with many allies. We all agree, of course, that Strait has to open up again. And what I know is that allies are working together, discussing how to do that. What is the best way to do it? They are working on that collectively to find a way forward.
Working on that collectively to find a way forward. Trying to dull the blade with America, it sounds like to me. For more on the topic and related matters, pleased to be joined by Eliot Wilson, contributing editor at Defense on the Brink and senior fellow for national security at the Coalition for Global Prosperity. Eliot Wilson, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning.
So is my interpretation of what NATO Secretary General Rutte had to say your interpretation as well?
I think the Secretary General has a difficult role to play in a sense because he's trying to coordinate rather than do anything executive. I think there are two different issues here. There's using NATO as a tool as an alliance to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which isn't really what NATO is for. It's a defensive alliance. But I think there is an onus on most of the members of NATO to look at this as something which is an economic problem for us all. I mean, it's not just America's problem. If the Straits of Hormuz are closed, that's a fifth of the world's oil, a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas. That is not something which is sustainable. And countries like my own in the UK, countries like Britain and France and Germany, we all have to look at this as a problem which is presenting to us right now, which has to be fixed. The problem is how we do it, because militarily, certainly, forcing the Strait of Hormuz is going to be extremely difficult, and we're not quite sure how that's going to be done. But I think we do need to be talking very carefully and very closely to the administration in Washington to find a way that this can be done with a decent distribution of burdens, because it's clearly not America's job to police the world, and shouldn't be, but also how we do it practically and how we get to a stage where there is a safe passage through the Strait and also diminution further of the threat from the regime in Tehran.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, to me, it seems like, yes, the issue of NATO and this specific job of reopening the Strait of Hormuz are getting conflated. I understand this is not sort of consistent with the vision for what NATO is as a defensive alliance, as you just mentioned. But we sort of, in the sort of common vernacular, we use our NATO allies almost synonymously with Western Europe. And what we're really saying, and what the president is really saying is, I expect our Western allies to show up when we ask them to show up, just like we show up when they ask us to show up. You can, whether you put it under the NATO umbrella or just our Western allies, it's really functionally the same thing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that, and I think so long as everybody understands that that's what it's being used as a shorthand, that's fine. I think that France's position is extraordinary, that it has no sort of interest in the matter at all. I think that's not sustainable. I mean, if France is saying that it derives no economic benefit from the trade that comes through the Strait of Hormuz, then that's an odd geopolitical stance to take. I think all of the major powers of Western Europe have to accept that they have a problem with this potential situation just as much as America does. In fact, America possibly has less of a problem because you, of course, are the world's biggest producers of oil. We're importers to a much greater degree. So I think there does need to be a little bit of common sense in the room, and a sense that this is a common problem, and it's not going to be an easy one to solve. There isn't a sort of, there's not simply a dial up which we can turn up in military terms and that will solve it. It's going to be very complex and very dangerous ultimately. But it's not something we can walk away from.
Right. I mean, how much of this, too, is Europe just trying to use sort of this is not what NATO's for as a cover story, because they really don't have the wherewithal, economically, at minimum economically, to some extent militarily too, to devote these kind of resources to this particular campaign?
I think more than that, there's in some countries, and it's not universally true, but in some countries there is more a political aspect to it, which is that from time to time, European countries find it useful to distance themselves from what America is doing.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of these occasions in some cases. I think that's been there's been the case to an extent with the British Prime Minister. I think he's played his stance on the whole issue of Iran for the past 3 or 4 weeks as a kind of distancing himself from what is seen as the traditionally sort of unilateral and aggressive American policy towards Iran. I mean, I think what we need to remember is that there are very few people who benefit from Iran's regime staying in place. This is a bad country. This is a bad regime. It's murdered tens of thousands of people. It's probably killed 30,000 of its own people since last December, just with the strikes and the protests against the regime. This is a bad country, and no one should regret the falling of the regime if that's what happens. I think what sensible people need to recognise is that while we have that sort of common goal of getting towards the fall of the Islamic Republic and something better replacing it, it's going to be very difficult to get there, because it's always very difficult to bring about whether you want to call it regime change or a sort of more beneficial government to the people of Iran. Getting there is going to be difficult, but I don't think we should be in any doubt as to the fact that is good for everyone, except the people who are the heads of this criminal organisation which has run Iran for 47 years. So we need to concentrate on where we agree as well.
Yeah, I mean, one other matter too. I was just tickled by this New York Times piece. As Iran war drags on, Europe wants to avoid a new migration crisis. I don't know if the New York Times is just gourding its own axe or Western Europe's axe here to provide yet another cover story. But a new migration crisis. I'm sorry, which was the first migration crisis, and at whose hands did that occur? Number one. So what we're going to do now is we're going to say Iranian refugees fleeing a regime if it stays intact, and a country that has been decimated. This is, all this sort of Middle Eastern and North Africa refugee matter that is the direct result of 30 years of open borders. No. It's just the direct result of President Trump's military campaign against Iran. That this is where we're going to go now.
I think that seems to be a slightly sort of knee-jerk generic reaction, doesn't it, to any sort of crisis in the Middle East? I mean, there was an issue when with the Syrian refugee crisis that it did send millions of people out of Syria and partly to Western Europe, but actually mostly to Lebanon, which was almost overwhelmed by refugees. But I think it's one of those things where you look in the drawer to see what excuses there are, and refugee crisis it's an easy one to pick out, because nobody can disprove it. It's a wonderful argument in the sense that nobody can say that definitely won't happen. But I think on the list of priorities and risks as well, that's fairly low down the pecking order here.
This is the reporting by Trey Yingst to Fox News on the killing of Iran's intel minister yesterday. Take a listen.
A senior Israeli official telling Fox News that Ismail Khatib, Iran's intelligence minister, was killed in a precision strike overnight. Khatib was responsible for managing Iran's global cells, these sleeper cells in countries around the world that even threatened U.S. politicians and President Trump. This official says this man had blood on his hands, American blood. They go on to say that Khatib was actually the only person to survive the opening round of strikes in Operation Epic Fury that killed Iran's supreme leader. Those 40 officials killed in around 40 seconds.
I know it's tough to get a handle on, but we've been talking to people that are, policy experts in this space over the last 2 weeks, of course. And as this campaign has proceeded, there's a belief among some that the prospect of the popular revolt that Trump won and the West want to see ushered in is actually plausible. It's not definitive. It's hard to handicap, but it's plausible in part because there is this methodical taking out of the principles of the Khomeini regime, such that you may have if you can do some things like secure IRGC weapons depots and so forth, you may have a real opportunity because the decapitation strategy will have worked.
I think it's certainly not out of the bounds of possibility. I think there is clearly a sort of wellspring of hatred of the regime in Iran, which is understandable because, the people of Iran have suffered horribly for nearly 50 years. I think one of the strange things that opponents of this kind of thing tend to suggest is that, by killing, whether it's the head of the intelligence ministry or senior defense chiefs or something, that'll make the Iranian regime hate us. And you think, well, they already hate us. They've hated us for 50 years. This is non-negotiable. We are not going to annoy them further by doing this. Again, it's a matter of being clear-sighted. What do we want? We want to degrade the Iranian regime's capability, certainly in terms of nuclear weapons, but also in terms of loosening its grip on power. And ultimately, we want to see that regime go. It's a matter of how we get there and the most practical way of doing that, which is difficult to plot. But as you say, I think we've probably got a potential for some kind of popular uprising from within Iran that is greater than I would have thought it's been for some years. So we need to remember that in a lot of cases we're not divided here by massive deep principle, or at least we shouldn't be. We all want the same thing, which is the downfall of the Islamic Republic and a more free, democratic, pluralistic, liberal regime in Iran, which is a fantastic country with a millennia of history. So that's what we all want, and it's a matter of getting there in the most practical and efficient way.
Eliot Wilson, contributing editor at Defense on the Brink, senior fellow for national security at the Coalition for Global Prosperity. Eliot Wilson, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
And he joins us on Chicago's Morning Answer.
Hear about the big stories of the day, then talk about them right here on Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
The following is a real-life story from Trinity Debt Management.
I had a lot of credit card debt, and it stressed me out. But what I thought was a solution turned out to be a problem.